Hello, everyone. I think we're live here. Hello, hello. Just double checking my settings here. I think we are all up and running. Really nice to see folks here for our little open house that we have running here for the 2024 Comic Workers Survey. My name is Joan Zahra Dark. I am one of the founders and steering committee members for the Cartoonist Cooperative. I'm really excited to talk to y'all today about these most recent results and what this all means for the comics community at large. We had some really interesting data and methodology working through this year's survey compared to last year's, in both good and bad ways that we'll talk about here in just a second. So how about we dive right in with this year's Comic Workers Survey. I'll go ahead and get us moving. I think we're just going to go through just straight up through the table of contents here, which if you're looking at this and want to take through the whole report yourself, you can do that at cartoonist.coop as well if you'd like to look through the report on your own time if you haven't already. Very briefly, we got a little under 200 responses for our survey this year. That's nearly double the respondents that we got last year. We're really hoping to keep increasing the amount of comic workers that we get in our pool of responses for folks and how much they made in making comics each year as we keep improving. I think that's going to really help with showing off like a wider spectrum of the comics industry as a whole, especially in the US where we've been surveying so far. And we're hoping to keep this going as a resource continually as we keep doing this. And we had this run, if you hadn't seen it already, from July through August of 2024. You can see a little bit about our methodology here. I'm not going to get too into the weeds here on specifics. You can read through this on the full report, but you've got the info here around our 189 respondents, around the info that the data that we were collecting for conditions from 2023. And we did exclude some responses in the process of setting this up, specifically around like averaging hours worked, trying to get rid of some outliers from our data that didn't quite match up to what we knew were like proper standards, at least for like what was the average that people were really getting paid in a lot of ways. And you can see the sample size and margin of errors there, as well as how other questions were broken down. Getting into our findings proper, though, we start with the demographics of our respondents, which we have a lot more data from compared to what we had last year. And you can see here that we had the majority of folks who responded to our survey in the 25 to 34 age range, 32% in the 35 to 44% age range, 9% in the 18 to 24 age range, 6% for 45 to 54, and one respondent either from 55 to 64. Not surprisingly, I think, given the amazing work that comes out of comics, we have an overwhelming amount of folks on the queer spectrum. In terms of our demographics for respondents, with 46% of respondents specifically reporting as being somewhere under the trans umbrella. It's very nice to see. Yeah, I think we're definitely skewing younger in terms of folks that we're reaching right now, which makes sense with a lot of social media outreach. But I think we've also got some folks on skewing in different age ranges as well, which is really nice to see. We also have a little more respondent data in relation to ethnic categories here. That's broken down. You can also see the data broken down in terms of class demographics, with participants identifying as working class for 36% of respondents, 40% of respondents identifying as some sort of middle class, and 18% identifying as being low income or near the poverty line, which I think is going to be very important for us to talk about as we continue. That is a staggering number of people, even for just 189 respondents that we have here, for how many cartoonists, even from our small sample size, that are working near the poverty line across the US right now. And we got a lot of respondents who identified either as being deaf, disabled, and or dealing with a long-term health condition, with a considerable amount of overlap with folks who responded in that category also considering themselves working class or having low income. I think, as we talked about in our conclusion that we'll get to before, chronic overworking in the comics industry is something that is going to lead to folks developing a lot of work-related conditions that are things that could easily be more well treated with better working conditions, with better industry standards for care for comic workers as a whole, that we just don't have right now as an industry with no set of benefit standards for folks who are making comics for large book publishers, for the direct market in really any capacity. Moving into career statistics, we have 42% of respondents characterizing themselves as emerging career comic workers, with 30% listing themselves as established career workers. This is really self-identifying in terms of where people are placing themselves in terms of their career. Our respondents this year averaged around 18 years working in comics, just on the whole, doubling our 9-year average for our 2024 survey. A lot of our respondents are showing up as we're getting more of a sample size, folks that have been doing this a long time. And some folks we'll see that some folks are seeing the information, or some folks are seeing more out of that work. A lot of folks are not. A lot of folks are still dealing with as we're seeing, we've got a lot of low income respondents, despite the fact that we have folks who have been working in comics a long time. 79% of respondents identified as cartoonists, fulfilling all roles in that work, doing penciling, doing inking, coloring and lettering, doing basically all of the work that goes into making comics. And with our larger sample size, we still only have about 38% of respondents listed as agented, which is roughly around what we saw with 40% of respondents responding having literary agents having representation compared to last year. And you can see the kind of rough breakdown of how our respondents are located in terms of the top 5 spots for our respondents, where they're coming from, with California, New York, Washington, Oregon, and Illinois, rounding out those top 5 spots. And you can see the annual average cost of living for each of those areas, according to Forbes, for 2024, which, again, we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into things later on. In terms of where folks are distributing their work, and how they're distributing it, we did not have this as an exclusive question, but had 63% of participants reporting largely working on one-shots or single-issue comics, and 56% of respondents reporting that they regularly work on graphic novels, with a breakdown here around where people are focusing their work. I think it's notable that we have the majority of folks that responded to this question around audience focus really working on comics for adults, as well as folks working on comics for young adults. Although, again, we're noting that these are not exclusive categories in this question, but I think it's important that there's a lot of artists who are trying to make comics for adults primarily, and that clearly there is an interest there that maybe is not being served potentially. If we go into comic distribution, in terms of where folks' work is getting put out, these are also non-exclusive categories in relation to where folks' work is in print. 92% of respondents have comics available in North America, with 65% only having work available in North America. You can see the breakdown works out a little bit less as we get into where folks can have work in print in Europe, in South America, in Australia, Oceania, with 7% of our respondents saying that they do not have comics available in print at all. We got a considerable amount more in the way of respondents who are self-publishing, who are working on webcomics, that I think, as one of the conclusions that we got from this year's survey, is that I don't think we quite have a framework in mind yet from the questions that we sent out for this survey to specifically address the needs of folks who are primarily working in webcomics, who are working in self-publishing in relation to these questions. I think there are points that are getting to that, but maybe don't specifically address the concerns / needs in relation to self-publishing and the webcomic spaces. So I think that is something that is really going to be something we try to improve as we get into our next survey. talking about distribution in terms of conventions and festival sales. 45% of respondents consider themselves occasional festival/convention sellers. 15% are regular sellers, and 40% have never sold to conventions or are not currently, which again speaks to the folks that we're reaching right now. And for folks that did sell at conventions and festivals, 27% report making between $100 to $500 a day after costs. 11% are making between $500 to $1,000 a day. 10% make up to $100 a day, and just 2% of respondents report making over $1,000 a day, with the remaining respondents either breaking even, making a loss, or not making any money at all from these events. And in terms of production, we also have metrics here around respondents spending about 7 to 21 hours a week on comic production, with around 10% of participants scaling up every 7-hour interval until working over 50 hours a week on comics, which I just want to let that point sit there for a second for folks to talk about folks who are working over 50 hours a week on comics, especially as we get to we're going to talk about our page rates and advances in a little bit here, but I just want to make sure we have 50 hours a week. Give that the space that it deserves. Going into income statistics, going down, we have 52% of participants working on comics as their primary occupation, with 48% having some other job alongside comic production. Not all of these questions were required in relation to the survey, but for folks that did answer, 76% report making comics as their primary source of income. Although we do have folks who are talking about only being able to make comics in their free time. I think this is getting to what we're talking about in terms of self-publishing and webcomic artists having different priorities that we're not necessarily serving. That being said, we have good info here in relation to the 22% of comic workers who are receiving some form of financial support from friends or family, along with other work, with considerable amount of respondents here either having other full-time employment, part-time or freelance employment, regular work, as well as freelance opportunities and or financial support. I think it's really important to talk about the amount of artists that are only really able to make comics as a result of having other work, having some kind of financial assistance, especially as we get to the number at the bottom here, where the average for what artists are making off of comics, according to our survey figures, is around $5,600, and only around $5,000 if we count folks who did not make any money off of comics in 2023. Contrasting that with the average of around $50,000 for what comic workers are roughly expecting for annual income to live comfortably without assistance, this is really dire in terms of the actual money that is coming in for folks who are working on comics, what folks are receiving for that work compared to what people actually need to be able to live. And I think it really speaks to, even with flawed methodology aside, the dire nature of the comics industry as it stands, and that comics work is severely, severely underpaid. Going into page rates here, I think as a preface here, we should get into the fact that our methodology, as we I think have talked about a little bit in various circles online, it has been a little bit skewed in ways that we necessarily weren't anticipating, along with what we've talked about for the self-publishing and webcomic artists that were not necessarily served as well by this survey. I think the questions that we framed our survey on this year led to some results that really don't necessarily represent the industry as a whole. And I think it's important for us to fully acknowledge that some of the numbers that you're going to see here are as a result of the flawed methodology that we put forward, the questions that we put up that are not necessarily getting meaningful data that we can parse in a way that actually translates to the numbers that comic workers are actually seeing in terms of what folks are getting paid. So I think it's really important just to put that up front as we talk about some of this, just to make sure that we're doing our due diligence here. That being said, going into this, we have the average for scripting. When we put this out there, respondents were asked to have their page rates divided across scripting, pencils, inks, colors, and letters, where if folks were paid in one lump sum to roughly try and divide up their what they received between these stages of comics development. With scripting, folks being paid $69.39 on average a page, with the highest rate recorded being $1,500 a page, with respondents roughly averaging 2.48 hours of work a page, with the average highest hourly rate reported being $27.98 an hour in 2023, based on that metric. On average, for pencils, we have $87.46 a page, with the highest rate being recorded as $700. These respondents were averaging 4.65 hours of work a page, with the average highest hourly rate in this metric being $18.81 an hour based on that data. Inks goes on for $76.21 a page, with the highest rate reported being $225, with an average of 4.96 hours of work. That comes out to $15.36 an hour. Colors, the average is $67.94 a page, with the highest rate reported being $200. The average, highest hourly rate, breaks down to $17.56 based on the average hourly work. And for letters, we've got $42.72 as the average, with the highest rate reported being $180. These respondents were averaging 1.3 hours of work a page, with the average highest rate being $32.86 an hour. I once again want to thank everyone who has come forward since we put stuff out to try and get some better averages in place for what we can with the outliers that we have corrected since the initial release of the survey. And I also think that there are some flawed methodology practices in this survey that we're just not able to work around with what we have at the moment. Going into advances, for folks who may not be familiar, an advance is typically what comic workers are offered an author or a creative team, basically an advance on what a book would potentially be earning out in royalties after the book releases, is what's referred to as an advance, with the idea that these advance payments are often cut into installments, based on certain milestones, with the initial advance commonly referred to as a signing advance and the final payment typically being considered a delivery advance on all files being delivered. You can see the average and highest advances illustrated here, with the averages for comics up to 25 pages being $3,400, the highest advance reported being $12,000. The average advance for comics between 26 to 150 pages was $17,000, with the highest advance recorded being $50,000. The average advance for comics 151 to 300 pages was $45,000, with the highest advance recorded being $115,000. And the average advance for comics 300 pages or higher was $100,000, with the highest advance recorded being $125,000. I want to note how the averages and highest rates seem to be getting slimmer and slimmer as we keep getting into higher and higher page rates, which is notable in relation to the amount of labor that is being asked of artists in that regard. But in terms of the advance payment split for everything that we've talked about, only 10.5% of respondents did not have the advances that we just spoke about broken into installments. 35% of respondents had these advances broken into 2 installments. 24.5% of respondents had this broken into 3 installments. 24.5% again had this broken into 4 installments. And we have 2% of respondents receiving 5 separate installments of these advances, and 6 installments making up the last 3.5% of our respondents here. It's really important to recognize how a figure like $100,000 in relation to an advance sounds like a lot of money, though when that money is broken down into theoretically 6 installments over the course of a few years, over the course of even a few months at the very earliest, it suddenly starts looking a lot less compared to how much people are actually expected to live off of in terms of just trying to survive. Which, as we're looking at here in terms of the months worked, respondents mentioned an average work of 3 months for books up to 25 pages, an average of 9 months of work for books from between 26 to 150 pages, an average of 14 months for books from 150 to 300 pages, and then an average of 8 months for books over 300 pages. Which, this being the average, we have numbers that are higher and lower than these amounts. I just want to stress again how much these figures start to break down as books are being worked on for 2-3 years, and an advance suddenly becomes a lot slimmer in terms of what folks can be expected to live off of. The average work time scheduled by a publisher in relation to what we just talked about, for folks working on books up to 25 pages, publishers on average schedule 2 months to work on it, which I want to remind folks that average work time was 3 months. The average scheduled time for books from 26 to 150 pages was 9 months, compared to 9 months of work in that regard. The average schedule for 150 to 300 page books was 17.5 months in that respect. And for books over 300 pages, publishers on average are scheduling 33 months to work on that. And in relation to when folks actually got their payments for these advances, 50% of respondents reported no tardiness in receiving payments. 30% of respondents reported waiting 1 to 3 months later than they were expecting to receive their installments. 11% reported waiting 4 to 6 months. 5% reported waiting 7 to 9 months. 1% reported waiting 10 to 12 months, and 2% reported waiting over 13 months, which, for the low amount of money in relation to these installments, to then have to wait potentially months and months after these installments are reportedly meant to be paid out, and having to figure out other work and continuing to produce the comics on these deadlines that are set up here, it is really frustrating to see the amount of people that are counting on this money to live off of that are not even receiving that in a timely fashion. It is unacceptable. In relation to royalties, which royalties being defined here as the amount of money the publisher pays to an author from the sale of each book. These can be defined as either a retail price royalty, the percentage an author gets for every copy sold based on the retail price, or a profit participation royalty, sometimes called a back-end royalty, where an author is paid a percentage of the book's net profits, a profit share type system. 45% of respondents for our survey were not offered royalties for their work. 70% of respondents received a retail price royalty, while the rest were given a profit participation royalty. In relation to how royalties were paid out, the average book royalty was 8% of retail price, with the highest royalty rate recorded being 70% of sales, with an average high of 27% of sales. The lowest recorded rate being 0% of sales, as we've seen with folks not getting royalties, and an average low of 16% of sales for folks that had that offered. We're going to talk about a little more about work for hire in a second here. The fact that folks are, I think it's really important in terms of folks receiving these royalties or having these rates is really important, not only just for what we have laid out here, but also for the fact that many of the books that we're talking about here may not even potentially earn out the advance that we previously talked about to be able to receive royalties in the first place, which calls into question the rates that are being laid out here. This is not data that we necessarily have quantifiable metrics to speak about here, but I think it's worth noting in relation to royalties and advances, whether folks are actually receiving the royalty rates that are being received here, that are being projected here. As we get into work for hire, in relation to royalties, a work for hire or work made for hire refers to folks whose ownership belongs to a third party rather than the creator. The copyright for these works remains with the third party remains with the third party as opposed to the author who created the work, and can be established through a contract before this particular work is created. In relation to royalties, what we found was over a third of respondents do not see any further income for their work from royalties, licensing, merchandising, or derivative works, with that being 35%. Very important to note for the amount of folks who are seeing their works turned into animations, are turned into have media rights for film, for TV, that are potentially not seeing any of the actual profits, any of the actual income out of that work as a result of that, is or don't even have the option to pursue any of that for themselves, is extremely disheartening. And talking about one of the big new things that we talked about at the end of this year's survey was trying to just get a general consensus from the respondents around challenges that they were facing in terms of their comics career, their ability to make comics, and what they would like to see happen, what they would like to see change in terms of the industry overall. We got a lot of different, very interesting, very insightful responses in relation to challenges that people are facing. A few key challenges that I think are really important to note here come with for folks to be able to make comics come down to the financial, many noting the lack of income or financial support for their comics work and the lack of opportunity to make money off of their comics. And two other obstacles most often noted coming in the way of the lack of time to create, as well as the lack of support or interest. And many also struggle with the creating comics around their mental health, mental or physical health, dealing with disabilities, the pressure to be caregivers to their family, dealing with lack of training, professional development, lack of comic community or resources in their area, lack of confidence in their abilities, fears of discrimination. By and large, the three challenges we saw the most were, as we said, lack of financial income or expectation of it in the future, lack of time to create, as well as lack of opportunities to generate income, where even if folks have theoretically the time to create comics, being able to actually get payment in that regard to have opportunities to put their work out there were not available based on what we're seeing from our respondents here. We're also seeing a lot of challenges in the way of accessibility to mass tabling events for increased COVID safety. The co-op has a masking initiative that folks can take a look at if you have not seen that already. Balancing social media promotion with work, poor communication with publishers, and the lack of resources to negotiate with them, lack of support for 18 plus creators, and book banning. Overwhelmingly, the challenges that we're looking at relate to finding other sources of income to support their work and balancing that with their comics work. Finances coming up again and again as the thing that folks are struggling with the most in terms of just being able to make comics and make money making comics. And our conclusions. Even with the data that we have that is somewhat flawed in our methodology, we are able to break down an average of around $27,000 a year, with a median of $12,000 for traditionally published work, which is extremely bleak. And just like last year, what we're talking about is including advances, royalties, and fees from licensing and subsidiary rights. This comes out to $6,000 more than last year's average, which makes sense considering we have roughly double the respondents. But this is still well under the average reported income needed to cover living expenses for respondents at around $50,000. Many comic workers are continuing to work below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, with our averages not being representative of many of the respondents that we're seeing that are working far below those rates. And we can truly see, as we talked about, how much financial support is holding up the work of so many USCN comic workers. I think it's important to talk about. We kind of went over our demographics a little bit in the beginning, but we can kind of get an average picture of what our average comic worker is looking like as a result of the work that we're doing, which I think is really interesting. From our data here, we can see that the majority of USCN comic workers, based on the information we have been career comic workers for some time, although many are still emerging artists. The average comic worker is likely to be a cartoonist doing the majority of work for comics by themselves, is fairly likely to be working class or bordering on the poverty line, and also dealing with some form of marginalization with respect to gender, sexuality, race, class, or disability. And I think it's really important to, again, touch on the, even without the meaningful data in relation to self-publishing, $5,000 for how much the average USCN worker is making from comics in 2023 is staggering in relation to how fragmented the funds are that are coming out, as we've talked about, how late these funds are coming, if folks are potentially waiting a year to potentially receive them. There's a huge disparity, as we're seeing, between from where folks are seeing their money coming from in relation to traditional publishing and the advances versus what's actually being sent to them in relation to making money through comics that year. I don't think we have the accurate data to make considerable speculation. This could be the result of disparities with experience opportunities, as we've talked about, time to work, among other possible causes. I think this is something that we're going to have to look at for future worker surveys to further account for in terms of the unpaid labor that comic workers are dealing with, the self-published work that we want to shine more of a spotlight on, or simply comic workers that are unemployed and are not able to find the work that they meaningfully can in the years that they're reporting this data, and simply don't have the numbers that they might in other years compared to if they're in the process of setting up a book deal or in the process of finding new work in the near future. In closing, I think it's worth noting anecdotally that in the process of putting this report together, we have heard from multiple sources about how publishers are closing off in relation to comics compared to years past. We've already seen avenues for small press publishing further shrink or become unviable in the first half of this year. And for books that are publishing, work schedules still seem to be wildly off in terms of meeting deadlines or rushes to make these advanced splits that aren't necessarily being paid on time, with even the averages for the work delivered not necessarily representing the over-under of folks that are taking more time than the publishers are allotting. And I think it's impossible to overstate how, compared to the data that we were collecting from 2022, the landscape for putting out comics online and talking about folks' work is vastly different compared to 2023 that we were collecting data from. We're seeing the huge decline of X/Twitter as a huge factor in the decline in income that folks are seeing. I think more research is going to be needed to confirm this theory. The rise in generative AI is an increasingly overwhelming threat that the co-op has made a statement for. And I think we're seeing that the devaluing of art across the board is coming as a result of folks who would like to think that artists do not necessarily need to be paid if services can be done through generative AI instead. As we keep growing with the Cartoonist Cooperative, we've said this in years past, but the only way forward that we see is with collective care, collective knowledge, and collective action to show up for each other, share when we're working through grueling deadlines, make sure that publishers are actually giving back to the workers that make them successful in the first place, and use our collective strength to fight back when we don't get what we're worth. And that is the end of the overview for this year's survey. Thank you so much to everyone who has contributed art here. We have the survey copy that I'm gonna skip past here. I really want to thank everyone who contributed interstitials to the spot art that we have for this year's survey. It genuinely means a lot to have so many members contributing to make sure that these reports look as amazing as they do. Everyone that contributed to layout, everyone that contributed to data collection and analysis to make sure that this was possible. We're really grateful to make sure that this is continuing as a multi-year effort and trying to make sure that the survey is something that we continue to improve on as we continue year after year. This is work that we're despite all the problems that we're dealing with, feel really proud of, um, and hope to continue and just keep improving as we go on. So thank you so much, everybody, who is coming through here. We genuinely appreciate it. Um, I think we're nearly at about an hour as we're going through here, so I think we might go ahead and wrap unless we've got anything from the stream to check in on before we do. Checking with tech. I think we're good. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody who checked this out live, who's checking this out after the fact in the recording. Sincerely appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Take care, y'all.